Good afternoon, everyone, all 157 of you so far. Welcome to our Ames seminar today. When we started these seminars years ago, we started them for the obvious reason of trying to communicate something about the work we're doing to the diverse group of people who follow the work of the foundation and are generally interested in the Hudson River. Over time, we realized that as important it was to, and is, to get reports out to the world on the research that we and others are funding, we recognize the extraordinary value of convening and having the chance to talk to each other, spill coffee over each other, and building the sense of community that I think is absolutely essential to the work that we do. It was with some reluctance that we started our first experiment in virtual participation by providing an opportunity for people to come in, not in person, but by webinar. And I'm glad we did. We could not then have imagined a time when everything would be virtual and we would try to search for community by looking at each other, Zooming day and night. It's in the spirit of our continuing effort to do that I welcome you. I think that it's particularly gratifying for me to look at the list of names as my participant list is populated and have a sense of our belonging to the river and to each other and to the important work that we do. I'm going to let Jim Lodge explain to you the particular importance of the work that's going to be discussed today. And he'll begin actually with a short video to help us understand the very rigorous process by which the Hudson River Foundation goes about selecting its areas of scientific interest.
Thank you, Clay. Slight friendly amendment. I did drop a video in the chat that I'll describe now for those of you guys who want to look for it. I guess I was too afraid of my tech here that it might fail, but for people who were in the city back in 2016, I think remember this time as somewhat unique in the harbor. And there was this just huge buzz about this humpback whale that was swimming around the harbor. And folks like me that know people that are out doing research and out in boats daily, it became sort of a rite of passage that's had seen this whale, and I hadn't yet had that passage, and we were fielding calls from the New York Times, the Daily News, the Coast Guard was running around, and then the New York PD running around trying to keep curious New Yorkers away from this humpback whale. And we at the foundation typically get calls about a variety of scientific issues from reporters trying to understand what's going on, and we do our best to try to help them. And in this case, both Dennis Gusky and I, Dennis was our science director, didn't have a whole lot to offer. So we all, we sent them to our friends at Gotham Whale and at WCS. And I don't actually recall, Howard, if Dennis knew to send them yet directly to you or not. But we had reached out to the BCS, and as I said, and others. And but I do recall very vividly sitting in Dennis's office, and our office at the foundation, for folks who haven't been there, has this great view looking south toward Governor's Island and to the Statue of Liberty. And so I'm sitting in Dennis's office, and somehow out of the corner of his eye, which is like, I have my back to the window, he says, "There it is, there's a whale," So I look out the window and I'm looking, and I don't see anything. And then, like, sure enough, that we spot this tail. And Dennis at the time had taken out his phone, which I was sort of joking with him that it's like kind of ridiculous, And then I make this comment which I cut out of the video because it's too embarrassing, but I guess I'm sharing with you now anyway, that's not a humpback because it's way too small. It just doesn't look like a humpback to me. But sure enough, it was. And that led to us sending that video to Howard and to Mindy. And and we began this conversation about, what more should we think about in terms of, what do we know about whales in the harbor and what should we think about? And that led in, so that was fall of 2016. And then in the spring of 2017, WCS and NHRF co-sponsored a workshop, and we brought in NGOs and universities from around the country, and folks like the Gotham Whale, Paul Sizwarda, and others to help us think through, where are our research priorities and gaps of knowledge around whales' use of New York Harbor. And we came up with two main takeaways. One, that the New York Harbor was really largely, not being covered by the existing projects that were out there that were typically, more focused in the Bight and out into the ocean. But also that we really need to understand more about the cetacean use of the inner harbor area and how that information could help inform management and mitigation decisions. And then the third one was that this use of acoustic technologies can be helpful to help us understand what a busy port, busy noisy port like Port of New York, and how does that fit into into other decisions around sort of management of the port. So that was a long-winded introduction to Howard and Mindy. But before I do turn it over to them, just quickly want to review the mechanics of Zoom, which I think most people are probably quite familiar with now. But we are recording the session. Obviously, you guys are all muted and your videos are off, but we're asking you to submit your questions in the Q&A. So there's a Q&A tab at the bottom as well as a chat function. And so folks, if you can use the chat to sort of have comments and have a discussion as the seminar is going forward, but try to pick, if you have specific questions that you want Mindy and Howard to address at the end of the seminar, if you could drop those into the chat, we'll get to them after the seminar is completed. I think we'll run about 50 minutes, 40, 50 minutes, so something till about 3-ish, and then we'll open up the comments and hopefully we can get all the questions answered. So I also dropped in the chat the bios of Mindy and I guess I should go with more formal, Dr. Howard Rosenbaum and Dr. Melinda Rekdahl. So please look at those for more information. It's I mean, Howard's affiliations alone would take about half of my time I'm allotted here. But the real brief one is Howard Rosenbaum is a senior conservation scientist and director of the Wildlife Conservation Society's Ocean Giants program. He's also a scientist at the American Museum of Natural History and a faculty member at Columbia University. And we're also joined by Dr. Melinda Rekdahl. She's an associate marine conservation scientist, also with the Ocean Giants program at the Wildlife Conservation Society. Dr. Rekdahl completed her PhD at the University of Queensland, Australia. And I think this is also a first for the foundation. She's joining us today from Australia at the bright and early hour of 7 a.m., I believe. So with that, I will turn it over to Howard and Mindy. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jim and Clay, and to everyone at the foundation for making this happen. We're very honored and pleased to be part of the seminar series and part of the online aspects here and connecting us all via Zoom. And we really look forward to the day of getting back and being in the conference room together with you, in due time, and to your, and to some of those great meetings that you all host. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to kick us off, and then I'm going to hand it over to Mindy, and we'll run through, and then I'll probably come back at the very end with a few closing remarks. So I hope everyone can see the screen. And Jim, thank you for that wonderful and thoughtful introduction, and all your kind words. And so I'm going to set the stage for all the work that we've been doing that's been supported by the Hudson River Foundation and the New York, New Jersey Harbor Estuary Program. We're very proud to be one of the grant recipients, and very excited to share with you some of the initial results that we've had. Before I get going and dive into all the work that we're doing together with the Hudson River Foundation, I want to take a step back and just tell you a little bit about who we are. I know many of you, I see lots of familiar friends and faces, not faces, but friends listed that are participating and as participants here. But for those that don't know, we're the Wildlife Conservation Society, the former New York Zoological Society, headquartered here in New York. We're 125 years old. Many people that are here in the New York area know us more affectionately as the city zoos and the aquarium, the Bronx Zoo, the Central Park Zoo, our New York Aquarium. You know, we own or operate those city zoos and parks. But there is so much more that you may or may not know about WCS, are the range of work that we do around the world to protect wildlife and wild places. One of the beautiful things that through the history of our mission, that's been the focus on protecting wildlife and wild places in the context of humanity. And our work focuses all around the world, both terrestrial and marine, in more than 60 countries where we operate. We're legally registered. We study wildlife. We work with governments to help protect their natural resources, and we mitigate some of the most pressing threats that occur to the spectacular wildlife. On this slide, you see some of our 16 priority regions with the little whale icon showing you where our Ocean Giants program, which is centered on our marine mammal conservation efforts around the world. And Mindy and I have both worked in many of these places around the world with our teams, be it, you know, as far as in South Asia, in the Bay of Bengal, off of Bangladesh, in the Western Indian Ocean, off the eastern coast of Africa and Madagascar, in the Gulf of Guinea, as well, off of the coast of Gabon, Congo, Angola. And again, we're looking at some of these priority habitats, some of these amazing whales, dolphins, and other marine mammals that are in these areas. We learn about these essential habitats in order to better protect them. Off the coast of Patagonia in Argentina and Chile, taking us up to North America and the Arctic, our work both in the US and Canadian Arctic, looking at marine mammals and protecting them, and closer to home in what's known as our New York Seascape program, where we focus on marine mammals, but there's a whole other body of work on sharks and other fish, on policy issues that is spearheaded by our New York Seascape program. So taking us closer to home and bringing us back to where we're working here in the New York Bight, which you see in the map here, just to orient you, and that's the New York Bight in terms of the overall frame of reference. We refer to as from the tip of Montauk all the way down to Cape May, New Jersey, and out to the continental shelf, and even extending beyond to the Hudson River Canyon. Is an area that's of key focus for WCS and our conservation efforts. And I wanted to just take the moment here to introduce you to some of the amazing wildlife in terms of whales and dolphins that exist here. And these are just some of the animals, not all of them. But many people, as Jim mentioned, are familiar with the humpback whales that have been seen with increasing frequency here in the New York Bight. You can go out whale watching, be it from Brooklyn or out at Montauk, and see these animals. You can even see them from the beach at times. Those sights of them lunge feeding through pods of Atlantic menhaden, are just spectacular. We have minke whales, one of the smaller of the baleen whales here. That's shown in the second photo to the left down, next to one of these actual pods of bunker or Atlantic menhaden. We have fin whales, the second largest animal that's ever lived on this planet. That's been here. Some of the animals that I grew up here in the New York area, animals that I saw my first whales out on a whale watch off of Montauk, and some of the first whales that I ever saw and had the pleasure of seeing. And these animals are here today. We also have one of the most endangered animals on the planet, the North Atlantic right whale. These animals are critically endangered now. There are only 356 animals about that remaining on the planet, and they are increasingly under pressure from ship strikes and entanglements, and we're going to come back to them toward the end. And then we also, close to shore as well, animals that you might see, even just strolling on the beach. We have this amazing population of bottlenose dolphins that one can often see from right in that New York, New Jersey harbor estuary area, from the beaches, and seeing these animals in the surf. So just to give you a quick introduction to some of these animals, there are more here, and we won't have time to get into all of them, but there are resources online where you can find out more about the amazing marine mammals that are here in our waters. And as Jim mentioned, the animal swimming up the Hudson, I believed aptly, I was named Gotham by our colleagues at Gotham Whale, garnered an amazing amount of attention. And I remember, Jim, getting that call from Dennis and asking if I would speak to ABC News actually, and speak to this phenomenon. And what was really interesting and exciting here, and what was drawing a lot of the interest, was that in many years, in past times when this had happened, it often was emblematic of something that was foreboding. The animal might strand, or it was a sick animal. They were swimming into these typically out of normal habitat areas because they were either sick, or they were they were ill, or they'd been hit by a ship or something. In this case, it was an animal that that was taking advantage of large concentrations of bunker and feeding well up into the river, and you had that amazing experience of seeing it from your window. Dennis sent the video to me, and again, I thought it a bit much to try to play it here, but it was, I really appreciated all the enthusiasm and interest from you and Dennis, and in terms of trying to think and understand more about the marine mammals in the New York Bay. But again, a lot of what's happened recently over the last few years, as these animals have been incited with increasing frequency, and with these iconic issues, and shots of whales lunge feeding at the Empire State Building in the background, there's been some attention that's got through the media, but with that, and animals being here in the New York Harbor area, there are concerns about animals dying in numbers that we haven't quite seen before, whether that's due to ship strike or entanglements. These have been concerned, and this has also been captured by the media to some extent, but this continues to go on. And yet there still is this amazing phenomena happening that is not just gathering national but also international attention for the whales here in the New York area, but also in the New York Harbor area, what's termed the New York Bay. To put it into context in terms of some of the mortalities that have been going on, there are 3 open unusual mortality events along the eastern seaboard, the Atlantic coast, from Maine to basically to South Carolina, for 3 different species: humpback whales, and we'll focus in on some of the strandings that have happened here since 2016. The latest statistics due to NOAA that about half of these overall show some interaction with ships, and likely due to ship strikes. And again, you can imagine that happening with animals feeding in these areas with increasing frequency, potentially that they're coming more into contact with ships. North Atlantic right whales, again, this highly endangered, critically endangered animal, subject to ship strikes and entanglements. In the New York Bight area, overall, the larger area, there have been 2 recent mortalities: a calf that was recently struck, as well as an animal that stranded off of New York last year. You don't know whether that was actually that actually, I believe, showed signs of blunt force trauma consistent with a ship strike. And actually, there was a recent animal sighted that was an entanglement that we don't know the outcome of that animal, but what its fate is. But also minke whales that are also part of these unusual mortality events, where it shows some degree of types of anthropogenic impacts, human interactions, as well as an infectious disease component. And again, there have been 16 strandings of minke whales in the New York area since 2017. So to set that context, there's this excitement going on, but there's some real concerns that are actually happening. And these concerns, can be broadly termed in terms of the threats that these animals and potential impacts that they face, whether they're due to fisheries and interactions. And again, we're just posing a few of these, which can lead to direct mortality, such as entanglements, injury or mortality, or ship strikes, again, injury or mortality, to noise that can have sublethal effects that's currently going on from shipping. There has been under the last two administrations interest in opening up the Atlantic coast to offshore oil and gas exploration and production, so seismic surveys, and as well as with the opportunities for renewable energy development here in the New York Bight, there are levels of noise that that may be increasing, potentially due to pile driving associated with installing offshore wind farms. And then in the lower left-hand corner, what those actual wind farms, we're all very interested and excited for the potential that renewable energy can bring to our world, but also working with the state and with the offshore wind energy industry to make sure that the best practices are considered, so that wildlife and these important habitats, are impacted to the least extent possible. But because a lot of the offshore wind farm development has happened, off of Europe, and some of the species like baleen whales don't exist in the same degree that they do in the New York Bight. What will happen when these offshore wind farms are installed in terms of behavior to these whales that we've been witnessing? So just a range of potential impacts that are of particular interest in the New York Bight, and even moving further inshore into the New York Bay. We've been working in the New York Bight for quite some time now, and I won't go into detail on the level of the work that we have been doing, but it consists of small boat surveys where we go out and we identify individual animals using photographic identification. We conduct population genetic studies by collecting small tissue biopsy samples from particular target species like fin and humpback whales. In the lower right-hand corner, you can see the extent of some of our survey effort over time from 2017 to 2019. We're obviously going to be focusing on this talk in the New York Harbor, New York, New Jersey Harbor Estuary area, the New York Bay. But the work that we're doing, again, uses some of these techniques, work on eDNA, which I know is of considerable interest to many here. And actually, that could be the subject of a whole other collaboration with some other support that we've had and paired up with the Hudson River Foundation, and that could be a forthcoming set of studies, and satellite tagging that's still forthcoming, and the acoustic monitoring that Jim started to mention. And so how we got here was looking at these, and Jim, you did a perfect tee up here for the work, was that we had done quite a bit of legwork, both ourselves and all of our colleagues, in terms of the priority setting in the wider New York Bight. And some of this had occurred through workshops organized by New York DEC and others. And again, this wider interest through Gotham Whale and our colleagues Cressley at the end of Long Island, this wider interest in whale watching in New York that has generated this considerable interest. But again, key gaps of information in the New York Bay area, in areas where there's high vessel traffic, risk of ship strikes, levels of noise, consideration for this Williams pipeline that would cut across from New Jersey to Coney Island, potential for cable landings for offshore wind. I could talk about storm surge barriers, et cetera, the issues that we've hosted and discussed at the at the foundation. But it seemed like it was time to really begin to think about the habitat use and importance for these areas for marine mammals, because it wasn't being covered in the wider New York Bight to the same extent. So as Jim mentioned, we jointly convened this priority setting workshop with the Hudson River Foundation in 2017. And we had a great participation, great number of sessions thinking about what needed to be done and how we would go about it, what we could start with. And many of you that participated in that workshop I see are on the webinar now. And that led us to initiate an approach supported by the Hudson River Foundation that involved dedicated and systematic acoustic monitoring in New York Bay. And I'm going to turn it over to Mindy Rekdahl to go into more detail about the approach, how we came up with the study design, and very excited to share some of the very first and initial results that we have with you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I believe Mindy's going to pick up and start sharing hers.
Thanks, Howard. Let me share my screen. Right, yeah, so yeah, thanks, Howard. So as Howard, or as it's been mentioned, the broader objectives of this project were to better understand what species are present in the New York Bay, and really focus in on their acoustic presence, acoustic behavior, and understand interactions with noise. So how noisy are New York waters? We recorded, so in order to do this, we deployed in 6 locations around the harbour. So the harbour is actually a really shallow water environment. There's not actually that many deep water areas that aren't shipping channels. So the main areas are dredged deep water areas. So the recorders were quite shallow. We deployed from October 2018 to October 2020. So this map on the left is just showing where the deployment locations are relative to the maintained shipping channels. We deployed sound trap high frequency recorders plus external battery packs to extend the life so that we could record for a longer duration. So we didn't have to come and retrieve the units too often, which is quite difficult over winter in New York. So we were really targeting a broad range of species. So to do that, we recorded at a wide frequency bandwidth, so up to 48 kilohertz, to target both the low frequency vocalizing species like baleen whales and the high frequency vocalizing species like bottlenose dolphins. Harbour porpoise are very high frequency, but the sound traps also have an inbuilt click detector function that allows harbour porpoise clicks to be detected, but it doesn't use a lot of storage space in the recording. So we were able to detect harbour porpoise as well. So the New York Harbour is a very challenging environment to deploy equipment in. It's a very harsh environment. There's really high current flow. It's very turbid water, cold water as well. There's a lot of vessel traffic. As we said, it's very shallow. So we were fortunate enough to have the New York Aquarium dive team who were very experienced deploying equipment in the harbour, and we were able to work with them to come up with the best possible deployment method for this challenging area. So to give you an example, on the right-hand side of the screen, the picture of this is how we deploy the units. It's essentially a subsurface buoy connected to a concrete block with the recorder at the top suspended with the battery pack attached. So essentially we prepare this on the boat and then we throw it overboard. But what we also did was have the dive team go down and double check that the deployment was successful and that the recorder was in a good place before we left it there for 3 to 4 months. But we also, because this is obviously not New York, this photo. We could not get a photo of our equipment because it looks more like the photo next to it with the diver. We decided that the dive team could probably not locate the units easily because we could not have a surface buoy as well. So we decided to use acoustic releases. So this allows us to communicate with the unit on the boat and send a signal to release it, and they just pop to the surface. So this proved to be a really successful deployment method because we managed to successfully retrieve all of the units over the 6 deployments. As you can see, often with a lot of life from below. Yeah, so this was a very successful deployment method, as I said. It's quite unusual to have this success rate, so we're really happy with that. We have an enormous amount of data to go through, but we did have a few equipment failures, connections to the battery pack and things like that. So there are a few data gaps, but there's still an enormous amount of valuable information that we've collected. So to give you an idea of how we go through and analyze the data, so this is, we go through both with manual review, so we look through the sounds, and we also use automated detectors. The manual review process is a really time-intensive process. It can, basically, we're going through in real time. So if we were to do that, it would take almost 2 years to go through all the data in real time, or longer, of course. So we manually reviewed a subset of the data every 4th hour of every 4th day. And to do this, we use a spectrogram, which is basically just a graphical representation of the sound with frequency on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And we listen to the sounds as well as look at the sounds. So what you can see here is echolocation clicks from Bottlenose Dolphins up on the top left, whistles and foraging buzzers. So this is just an example of the type of communication that dolphins produce. So all species have species-specific vocalizations. So this allows us to just go through the recordings and identify which species they are. And we annotate that and produce an idea of acoustic presence over time. But we also use automated detector methods to go through and process all of the data. Because obviously the manual review, we can't go through all of the data. The manual review process also allows us to really have a really good understanding of what is actually in the recordings, because automated detectors are a little bit limited for particular species. So we can't necessarily use those. And in high noise environments, it's challenging to use detectors. So we used automated detectors for harbour porpoise and dolphin clicks, and we're also running detectors for baleen whales, but we are coming into issues with just the high noise environment in the harbour. And we conducted ambient noise analysis using RavenX software. So now to dive into some preliminary results, and we've only just retrieved the last lot of units, so we're still processing some of these results, but we're excited to share results from the manual review. And just out of interest, we also, one of the benefits of using these acoustic releases is that they're also receivers, so they can receive tagged fish data. So we received lots of detections of 619 individual tags. And the main species detected were Atlantic sturgeon and striped bass, but there are also a range of other species picked up as well. And our New York Seascape team are managing that data. So this is just a general overview. This is the proportion of total days, the proportion of detections relative to total days of recording for each location. So this is just really a good way to visualize where we're seeing these 4 main species that we're detecting, and we're getting a lot of fish detections, but also a lot of bottlenose dolphin detections and humpback whales. We've also found this unknown delphinid over winter, which we think is pilot whales, but we're still getting confirmation of that. I thought something of interest, so sorry, that N equals 83, that's just the total number of deployment days for those recorders. So not all recorders recorded for the entire duration of the project. And the size of the circle reflects that as well. So something of interest is humpback whales in the yellow. I found it really interesting that we did actually get quite a few detections up inside the upper bay into the under the Verrazano Bridge, and a lot of those were social sounds, social calls, which I'll get into a little bit later on. So just diving into more specifically about humpback whales, as Howard has talked about, they've been seen with increasing frequency in recent years. We've observed them. This is just a map of some of our sightings data of both humpback whales with the red squares and bottlenose dolphins with the green triangles. We've seen them quite frequently in the lower bay during spring and summer, and we've seen them feeding on Atlantic menhaden, usually the smaller bunker. Humpback whales are a really good species to study acoustically because they produce a really broad range of sounds, and they're quite vocal. So they produce complex song breeding displays, which you can see in the top spectrogram here. They produce a really wide array of sounds, both low and high frequencies. So just to give you an example of this sound, I'm just going to play you some, but this is only produced by males, and it's a broadcast breeding display, and they tend to produce these songs mainly on the breeding grounds, as it's a breeding display. So this would generally occur over winter down in the Caribbean. I'll just play these for you. So as we can hear, it's a pretty remarkable display. But they also produce what we call calls or social calls, which are used more in social interactions, so more akin to like a conversation. And these are produced by males, females, and calves. So they're not as highly stereotyped, they're more sporadic, and they're also produced at a lower amplitude, so they're not as loud. So we tend to not detect them as often as we detect the broadcast song display. So some interesting results, or some interesting things that we're starting to see both in New York but also further north, is that humpbacks tend to are heard not just in spring and summer, but they're also heard singing over winter. So we think that some of the whales are overwintering here and are here almost year round. So this is a paper just about to come out where we looked at the distribution by Julia Zay, looked at the distribution of humpback whale song and social calls in the New York Bight, but this is a recorder off the shelf break. But it did show that we did have song over winter. So here in New York, we also found song detected over winter, and we didn't find song over spring. So this is just a graph showing percentage of days with detections over the duration of the project. So we did see social calls detected across most seasons, and this is not the final result. We're still going through and finalizing the social calls for the deployment, but we have picked up social calls over spring and summer and into fall. This is just an example of 2 recorders, just to give you a snapshot, basically. But we did overall see relatively few humpback whale detections, you know, relative to how many visual sightings that we've had and Gotham Whale have had and others, which we think could be due to masking in high noise environment. And again, this could be due to producing more social calls, which are the lower amplitude, so they're more easily masked by boat noise or high noise environments. Yeah, that's a smaller detection range of calls essentially, so they'd have to be very close to the recorder to actually detect those. But it could also be that they're just not calling while feeding. So a lot of the animals that we've had in New York that we've seen visually are single whales foraging in the harbour, and not many are actually, not many that we've seen have been interacting with others. So moving on to dolphins. This population is the Atlantic bottlenose dolphins. This is called the northern migratory stock, which migrate from New Jersey, New York, south to North Carolina over winter. So essentially, once the water temperatures drop, they head south. But we don't know that much about the dolphins around New York. There's been more known about the dolphins kind of around the New Jersey area. So it is interesting to start to delve into the bottlenose dolphin aspect of this project a little bit more. Dolphins produce a wide array of vocalizations as well. So they're also very good to detect acoustically because they produce whistles that they use in social interactions, including signature whistles, which are individually distinctive. But they also produce echolocation clicks frequently, just to navigate around their environment, but also to hone in on objects and for foraging. So there's been quite a big body of work looking at foraging buzz activity. So you can use the acoustic detections of buzzers as a proxy for foraging behaviour, so where they're foraging more often. So what we've found is very clear. This is just 2 recorders again, in New Jersey and New York, so the outer recorders. We found clear seasonal presence again. So they're only here over summer and spring and summer and into fall. So essentially March to October. Previous research has kind of suggested that they're here in May. So the fact that we did find them in March, and I think we even had them through to November on one recorder, was interesting. So they seem to be here seasonally, and that did kind of shift a little bit between years as well. And we did also find some difference in presence across locations. So we've been fortunate enough to work with Sarah Trabu, a Columbia master's student, and she's been working on this project first as an intern actually, and then moving on to masters. And she's diving into the data a little bit deeper, just to look at some aspects of the project, which I'll run through now. So something she's looking at for her master's thesis is looking at bottlenose dolphin foraging buzzers, as I mentioned, that can be that proxy of kind of looking at where dolphins may be foraging. So she's just looked at a snapshot of or a small part of the data so far. But they seem to be foraging more in basically it looks like right now is that they're foraging more in certain areas than others. So if you have a look at this map up the top, we've tried to visualize this for you so that around New Jersey 1 here in the red, it looks like although there was marginally more dolphins present, there was less foraging buzzers basically than New York 3 in the blue. where they seem to be foraging more, although there was marginally less presence. So this is something that Sarah's going to be exploring a little bit more in her project. And she's also going to be looking at whether this presence of foraging buzzers can be explained by environmental variables. So what is it about these habitats that draw the dolphins there? She's also looked at the whistles as well for another project that she's working on. I will also mention that Sarah is a Polgar Fellow with the Hudson River Foundation as well, and she has been looking into aspects of the bottlenose dolphin health, so skin lesions from our boat-based visual work, which is another really interesting aspect that we don't have time to go into here, but it's another interesting aspect coming out of what Sarah's doing. So for the whistles, she looked at 2 locations. She extracted 600 whistles from the data, which is a lot of whistles from 2 locations, New Jersey 1 and New York 3 in the map here. So this is where we found a pretty high bottlenose dolphin detections on these 2 recorders. She measured 11 characteristics of the whistles. So this spectrogram picture up the top right-hand corner here just gives you an understanding of how she's measuring those whistles and what parameters she's taking from those whistles. So having those whistle measurements then allows us to do a number of things, like compare those whistle characteristics to other locations. And here she's just kind of started to delve into this, but she just put together a quick table just showing potential differences between other published dolphin whistle characteristics. And you can kind of start to see that these New York Bight and Maryland populations are very similar, which is probably what you'd expect when compared to like Bimini and Panama populations. So we can start to look at or start to think about why that might be and whether that has to do with simply migratory versus resident populations, or whether it's just to do with the environment that they're in. So we can start to monitor for change over time as well, and in relation to noise. And that's some work that she's going to be diving into with both the foraging buzzers and also the whistle work as well. So a really interesting aspect of this project, I think, is coming out of this is our detections of harbour porpoise, because we know very little about harbour porpoise in New York. They're cryptic species and often solitary, so that we have actually never seen them from the boat in all of our hours on the water. And they are listed as a species of greatest conservation need by New York State DEC. And although they're not endangered here, they are critically endangered and vulnerable in other populations like the Baltic Sea. So they are very susceptible to fisheries bycatch, prey depletion, impacts from toxins, and they are a very acoustically sensitive species. So noise pollution and ocean noise is a real issue for harbour porpoise. And so is habitat deterioration. So we, the Atlantic Marine Conservation Society, or AMCES, are responsible for all the strandings in New York, are responsible for attending to all the strandings in New York. And they put together this map for us to show just where the strandings have been for harbour porpoise in recent years, so in the blue from 2017 to 2020, and historically from 1980 through. So we can see that there are a number of harbour porpoise strandings in and around this New York harbour area, which is of interest when we really don't see them visually that often. So our acoustic detections showed that they're actually present a lot. We found them year-round presence. This is just an example again of 2 recorders where we found a high number of detections, but we did detect them on all recorders. So we see here, this is split up into the proportion of foraging porpoise presence and foraging buzzers. So just looking again at that distinction between presence versus when they may be foraging. And we can see that they are kind of present year round, but there are definite peaks in detections. So from January to June. And foraging buzzers follows a similar pattern, which is probably to be expected. And we have had a preliminary look at whether there are any environmental variables linked to harbour porpoise presence using generalised additive models. And without diving too much into it, where we found that weekly sea surface temperature and chlorophyll were commonly correlated with harbour porpoise detection. So they might be, you know, a factor in determining presence. The next step, again, we want to look, you know, tying in with Sarah's project, is does noise affect when they're foraging and how they're foraging? There are a lot of potential issues with that without having visual data. So we're just exploring that aspect now. So just taking a little bit break from the results to think a little bit more about ocean noise, or to talk a little bit more about ocean noise, because it's a local and global issue of increasing concern that that, you know, a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of when they're not working in this area. Because it's hard to imagine how noisy the underwater world is, but it is incredibly noisy, and the natural noise is enough to make it noisy. As you can see from this picture here, whales, dolphins, fish, everything under there produces noise, but then we have all of these other anthropogenic noise sources adding noise to that already noisy baseline. Rain events cause noise, wind, waves, they all make for quite noisy environments. So everything that we're doing is adding noise to that already noisy environment. And whales and dolphins really rely on sound. It's critical for their navigating around their environment, for communicating, and elevated noise levels have been known to cause behavioural disturbance, so it might stop them foraging. It's been known to mask communication signals. So it's just like we might go into a noisy restaurant or to a concert and we try and talk to each other. We either have to raise our voices or stop speaking because we can't hear over the noise. So that's essentially what's happening to the whales. And it can also cause physiological damage. So if the noise is loud enough, it might cause hearing damage. So as we can't put headphones on the whales, we have to really think about this as we think about how to manage increasing noise levels in the ocean. So we're really interested in how noisy are New York waters. I mean, New York Harbor is one of the busiest ports in the US, so we would expect fairly high noise levels. And this map down the bottom left here shows an example of vessel traffic coming into New York. So as a heat map in the red, you can see that's high kind of vessel noise coming right into where our recorders are. So we kind of expect fairly high noise levels. And what we've seen is that it is in fact fairly noisy from our initial look at the data. So the spectrogram on the top here shows noise levels averaged across third octave bands on the y-axis and time on the x-axis over a 1 month period. So this is essentially a heat map again. So the loudest sounds are presented as red and the quieter sounds in blue. So as we can see, it's fairly noisy year round. So this is a long-term spectrogram, and it just shows these various noise events. So some of this may be fish choruses or, self noise from the recorder, but a lot of it is also boat noise down in the lower frequency bands. So we looked at comparing to, so we're really interested in, like, is this normal for New York or not? So we had a look at a paper produced by Aaron Rice et al. 2014. He's also a collaborator on this project, and just did an initial comparison to look at, how different are the noise levels in the harbour versus further offshore. So the recorder that was looked at for the Rice et al. Paper is out here between the shipping lanes off Long Island. So what we can see is that it is quite a bit noisier than the Rice et al. Paper. So the graph on the right shows the median equivalent sound levels recorded in our study compared to the Rice et al. Study. And the difference ranged from 13 to 27 dB, but across all frequency bands, the noise levels in New York were higher than those in the Rice et al. Study. So this isn't necessarily directly comparable, because the Rice et al. Paper had continuous recordings off the coast of Long Island in deep water versus shallow water, but it's something to just something to think about, that it is a pretty noisy place in the harbour. So just to show you, we've had, this is just an example zoomed in that paper. He showed that New York, New Jersey were some of the noisiest areas along the East Coast. But here is just an example of a snapshot of a month. This is all showing a month time scale. That Coney Island in particular is very noisy in those lower frequency bands, largely due to shipping traffic. And this Coney Island deployment, or New York 3 deployment, is right near the shipping lane. So it's really not surprising that there's that pervasive low frequency noise from the large ships coming into the port. So just to show you a little bit of seasonal variability that we found on the recorders, from winter at the top left through to spring, summer on the bottom left through to fall, we've found that it tends to be a little bit noisier in the higher frequency bands over spring and summer, which we think is probably largely to do with recreational vessels as well, and also signatures of the species themselves. So we're seeing dolphins in the higher frequency bands, as well as fish, a lot of fish choruses. And we are seeing, though, the large vessels is fairly pervasive throughout the entire year. So we're not really getting any quiet periods, I guess, in the harbour at all. So I guess, what we're showing is that there's a number of different cetacean species detected in the New York Bay, either seasonally or year round. And they seem to be using this habitat for foraging and potentially other key behaviours that are kind of critical for individual health and population health. We have found consistently high noise levels across most frequency bands in what we've looked at so far. So it's really gets to the question of what impact are these noise levels having on these species. They're obviously choosing to come into New York to feed, and they're in and around, large cargo vessels, and in summer around a number of recreational vessels. So we really have to think about, what potential impact is that noise having on those species, but also in relation to other impacts as well that these species are facing that could cause stress to the individual and the population, like vessel proximity, direct ship strikes, as we've been seeing, pollution, and resource competition as well. So there's a lot of fishing going on, and understand this in the context of cumulative impacts to populations. because I think it's a, we think it's a remarkable thing to witness these whales and dolphins in the New York Bay. So the question really now is how do we protect them as we're seeing unusual mortality events ongoing for a number of these species. I think that's really the crux of it. So what next? So just an understanding of some work that we're doing in collaboration with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute and Equinor, is we've got real-time buoys deployed further off the harbour. And this is just an example of a proven mitigation method, is that one of these near real-time detections of a critically endangered North Atlantic right whale initiated a voluntary vessel speed restriction zone beyond the New York seasonal management area. So this led ships to reduce speed to 10 knots or less, which reduces the chance of ship strike, but also reduces noise for these animals. So this is a really good way of showing just what technology is out there and what is available to start to think about mitigating some of these potential impacts to these species. So looking into the future, I guess, I think it's really important to continue monitoring at key locations within the harbour, particularly as things like offshore wind continue to ramp up in the area and other development as well. So we can really start to investigate, what's the drivers of temporal and spatial variability in species presence, and how is it potentially impacted by the human use of the area. Also focusing in a little bit more about potential impacts from small and large vessels. So looking at whether there's any behavioural changes in relation to presence to vessels, and also noise would be of interest. I briefly mentioned some of our work on looking at health aspects, so looking at skin lesions, for example, but we are noticing a number of skin lesions on animals in the New York Bight in general, in and around the area. So just for some continuing that work and starting to understand a little bit more about individual and population health where we can. And also following more on noise impacts on communication and critical behaviours.
That's great. Mindy, I'm going to share my screen for these last couple of slides, so you can stop sharing yours. I know this is the last two slides, and we're going to wrap up. So, so if Mindy stops sharing hers. Thanks, Mindy, for that great. So and just to wrap up, I hope this has given you and everybody here some better insights as to what we've been finding in the New York Bay with respect to whales and dolphins, and some really exciting results. And I think, the work that we've been doing, supported by the Hudson River Foundation, I hopefully helps, transform our thinking about, what we think about the New York, New Jersey harbor estuary for its, while it may be noisy, it is this amazing place where wildlife can be found, and you can get a sense of that by getting out and going on the water when you can, or seeing it from the beaches, but also getting out to our New York Aquarium and other resources that we have on our website, like this New York Seascape map that can kind of encapsulate some of the different species that are found so close to our shores and even further offshore. So we thank everybody here. We really want to thank the Hudson River Foundation, the New York, New Jersey Harbor Estuary Program, and the Tibor T. Polgar Fellowship. This was a true collaboration and has been a great partnership with the Hudson River Foundation. Dennis, Jim, Rob, Clay, Helena. This is your passion and interest for these topics. It comes through, and it's been really great to work with you. I won't read everyone's name here, but I want to thank our WCS team, our students from Columbia University, from E3B, the New York Aquarium dive team, the New York Seascape, New York Marine teams, and our boat captains that that make all this work possible. I mean, it takes a village, and this has really been a great set of results over the last 2 years, and we look forward to more to come. So thank you all, and thank you for participating in the webinar with us.
Well, thank you, Howard and Mindy. That was really great. I'm super impressed with all the work you guys have been doing. We have a bunch of questions in the Q&A and a few in the chat. Maybe I'll start with one of my own, I guess. And there's a couple of questions around, have you guys been, how involved have you guys been with the offshore wind studies that have been going on? And like, maybe can you talk a little bit about like what type of noise you're seeing from like wind farms generally, and really in comparison to, background noise you're seeing in New York Harbor and other ports, like outside of the wind farms?
So maybe I can start with the first, and Mindy, you can talk more about the noise. How does that sound as a good way to divide that up? So we actually have been at WCF been very engaged through the issues around offshore wind development, through NYSERDA, the New York State Economic Research and Development Authority has been actually leading this effort. And they have a process which is called the Environmental Technical Working Group. Just a couple of weeks ago, they had their State of the Science workshop on cumulative impacts. WCS, I sit on that, as well as Mindy and Dr. Anita Rekdahl, as part of our Dr. Anita Murray, as part of our team, also participate on the working group, and also the related to best management practices. So that's kind of like where we were teeing it up in the beginning. We also have a direct collaboration with Equinor, where we're using some of those real-time technologies. So we've been very engaged in this, because this is, both in terms of the siting to the construction, as well as to the operations, there are issues that we need to be thinking about. So maybe Mindy, you can take the second part of Jim's question.
Sorry, Jim, could you repeat that question?
I was just wondering if you could give a little comparison between the differences between the noise related to wind farms in comparison to noise related to ship traffic, and like just try to get a sense of like order of magnitude, how they compare.
Well, I think the main issue surrounding noise with wind farms mainly has to do with the development of the wind farm. So, for example, if pile driving is used to put in the foundations, that's kind of a really high noise source that needs to be mitigated against potential impacts for marine mammals. Noise, so they're kind of short-term noise, acute noise sources. But then there's shipping noises are fairly pervasive, as we've seen in New York in particular. It's a very pervasive continuous sound that is kind of changing the seascape or soundscape for the whales and dolphins when it's to that level. Of course, it gets louder when it comes closer to them, but there just seems to be this general louder soundscape for the whales in New York in particular. So to do with the offshore wind, I think during operation there's probably some noise associated with it, but it's probably minimal compared to some of those loud ship noise events.
That's great, thanks.
Jim, how would you like us to start answering the questions in the Q&A? Should we just, I mean, they're...
Do you want to go through and pick some of the better ones? And
they're all really good questions. I think we can get to.
Sorry.
There's one, and they come in at, for whatever reason, at different times. I think we covered some of the effects of noise on whales. I think that was asked before we got to that slide. Someone also asked if we had detections of right or fin whales in the study, and we're actively trying to detect those species. So, Mindy, do you want to speak to that a little bit in terms of some of those detections?
Yeah, we are. We haven't. We found a few possible right whale detections through our manual review process, but there weren't kind of there's a number of vocalizations that you need to have in the recording to conclusively say that it's that species, because there is some overlap between the North Atlantic right whale up calls and other species like bottlenose or just other noise that you hear. So there is potential, and we are running detectors through the data, but there are issues with the data being so noisy in running those detectors. So we'll see what we pick out, but no, the answer is really not at this point. We can't conclusively say we've had any right whale detections.
And maybe
fin whales as well, we haven't seen any fin whales detected on the recorders at all.
I mean, there is, and just to follow up, I mean, there's evidence that these animals are in these areas. We just haven't detected them in this period. So we just don't have an acoustic detection, but there are visual sightings. There are previous satellite tracks of these animals. So we know they do come through the area. Mindy, maybe here's another one that's related. Can we tell how far a whale is from a receiver or from the recording?
Yeah, no, we will be looking at kind of detection range information. For that, we need to look at like sound propagation in the area. Cornell, so Aaron Rice has looked at kind of propagation range for some of these species, or detection range for some of these species, just a little bit further offshore with the New York State DEC and Cornell project, where they deployed recorders for 3 years throughout the New York Bight. So he's shown some detection range information for those species, which I guess are fairly narrow. I'm just trying to think off the top of my head for humpbacks.
About 5 miles from 5 miles. I mean, both with Aaron and our colleague Mark Baumgartner from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, for which we're doing the real-time work. I mean, I think we're talking in that 5 to 5 mile, 6 mile range for humpback whale, some of the humpback whale calls, as well as and even shorter for some of the social sounds from what Mindy has shown from some of the data and North Atlantic right whale calls. I'm just going to keep.
Sorry, just to jump in there, from other busy areas, so as heavily trafficked as New York is in terms of boat traffic, I think dolphins, for example, it might only be 500 meters, the detection range. So, the higher frequency species, the sound doesn't propagate as far, so their detection range is a lot smaller than the lower frequency vocalizing species, like the fin whales in particular.
We have a question from David Secor from University of Maryland. Under the view that New York Harbor functions as a foraging arena, did you observe daily covariance between cetacean and fish detections? So
that's definitely something that we're interested to look into as we dive more into the data. Not at this point, and we're wondering. Part of the issue with fish, I don't know if there are any fish acousticians out there, but is that we don't have a lot of knowledge about the fish that are producing sounds out there. So I'm not entirely sure whether the fish that are producing sounds are the ones that the dolphins are eating. So that's something that we kind of need to investigate a little bit further.
Yeah, Dave, and just a little bit more on that. I mean, we've got some really interesting. I mean, that's something we're really interested in these drivers questions and this covariance. In essence, and we're kind of coming at it from a few different ways. There's the visual sighting, there's the acoustic data, and then we also have an eDNA data set too. So stay tuned on that one as well. Again, that could be a whole other topic of another seminar. I'm just kind of trying to tick through them so we can get to as many. Laura Morse from Orsted asked, question for Howard, assuming your bottlenose dolphin are coastal stock based on distance from shore and biopsy effort being conducted, for sure, Laura, actually, that's a great question about, there are these two different forms, an inshore and an offshore form of these dolphins. And actually, this past year, we actually had one of the first sightings that we've had of these larger offshore dolphins when we got out under our safety protocols under the pandemic and under COVID. But we've typically, when we get further offshore, we typically see common dolphins and other species of dolphins. But for one of the first times we've seen these offshore, and these are definitely one of the coastal dolphins, the coastal form of the bottlenose dolphins. We've not been biopsy sampling right now, because partly just because we don't have a defined collaboration or project to compare them to, but we do have a photo ID collaboration that we're looking with the Mid-Atlantic folks, as well as other catalogs. I think someone asked about the tracking changes through time, Lewis Kleinman. If whale dolphins might change over a much longer time scale, 30 plus years, and also to see ratio of species that are found over time. It would also be interesting to see if numbers and species change from the present by comparing results after pipelines and offshore wind feed cables are laid. Do you want to kind of speak to that a little bit, Mindy, in terms of baselines and things like that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think it's what we're trying to establish here in New York, because we don't really have those baselines. So in the past, I'd say 5, 6 years, there's been a big effort to try and establish some of that baseline understanding of where species are and when. So that's kind of part of what this project is about, is trying to establish some of that. Okay, what have we got now, and then how do we monitor that in the future, and does it change over time? So there is some sightings, visual information dating back to the 80s or earlier with aerial surveys. And that information is all interesting, but in terms of the acoustics, and particularly for the harbour in general, there really isn't anything to compare to previously. As you can see, we have strandings data that we can look at, and that's really interesting to see that historical perspective, and perhaps we can look at seasonal trends in that along with AMSEs, and compare that to our acoustics data. But otherwise, that's really what the crux of what we need to do now, is continue to monitor this area over time, and to try and better understand, what potential impacts there may be, and when are they here? Why are they here? When are they here?
I think I'm just trying to work through down the chat, and a few of them I can point to some resources that are online as well, so we won't take up a lot of time. But I think Mindy, you covered a list a little bit in when you're talking about noise. What are the types of noise that are likely to negatively impact whale? And we also talked about ambient noise versus anthropogenic noise, and noise from natural sources like wind and rain. Will whales avoid the upper New York harbor if there is noise, or will presence of food continue to bring them into New York harbor waters? Do you want to give it?
I mean, I think that's the really interesting thing, is that, we've witnessed whales, and I know others have as well, witnessed whales just feeding right around, or, in amongst all these boats. And obviously we are getting detections of humpbacks coming up under the Verrazano Bridge, and obviously seen them in and around the Hudson River Foundation office. So, they are coming up, and they do seem to be feeding a lot in that area. So I'm not sure, they don't seem to be avoiding it. So it's just really a question of, food must be that important for them to come in here and forage in that area.
Yeah, and there's some examples. I mean, we know these are for the most part, sublethal effects, some of these noise. I mean, there are lethal effects and, injury that can occur. And, you're talking about essential life function in terms of feeding. So there are examples from, for example, where Mindy was saying that some of these sounds could be masked, some of the communications could be masked. Doesn't mean that there's not an impact to these animals. And we've seen from some of the work our colleagues have conducted in the Arctic around some both chronic and acute forms of noise that animals can try to call, may stop doing things. And this has happened. This study's been done in the Gulf of Mexico, in and around, and Alaska around oil and gas development. So we do know that, animals do have a response. They're still going to continue with that essential life function to use those habitats, but doesn't mean that there's not an impact or measurable impacts, which, we're not we're setting the stage for, but we haven't quite got that answer here because we're establishing what those baselines are. And I think some of the work that Sarah, our student at Columbia, is doing, in terms of looking at the impact on foraging buzzes in the presence of noise, is that same types of studies that you can begin to look at, what are the impacts on communication from these levels of noise that are associated, these animals used during foraging. For some of the questions related to designing, or thinking about offshore wind and impacts, not to take up everybody's time here. I mean, these are great questions, but the NYSERDA Environmental Technical Working Group has a great website, NYSERDA eTwig. You can just look it up, and all of the what I really like about all the efforts that WCS and the offshore wind developers and all the NGOs and the state and federal agencies that are part of this, and of course spearheaded by NYSERDA and their team, it's all available online. So all of these documents, whether it's on marine mammals, whether it's on best practices, whether it's on all the workings of it, they have a very transparent, archive of it all. So you can find all of those things like there in terms of how we think about going about designing best practice, so that impacts can be minimized or avoided. But again, it follows the mitigation hierarchy where you're trying to, avoid, minimize, mitigate. So I think you can get to all of those issues. I think there's a next interesting question, and I'm sort of just, and Jim, I can stop whenever you'd like me to, but I'm interested in this question about the deepening of the shipping approaches and channels. The Army Corps of Engineers is planning this multi-year project for usable harbor area to 55 feet. And we haven't been consulted. We've engaged on some of those discussions are actually more around the storm surge barriers with the Army Corps of Engineers. But I think they're, because of these are timely topics and some of the data that we have, I think it's maybe time to kind of begin to think about these issues a little bit more, and potentially impacts from dredging and things like that. Mindy, do you want to take the next one? Do you see a correlation between the harbor porpoise population, the arrival of bottlenose dolphins in the spring, since they're competing for the same food?
Yeah, we have looked briefly at that, and they do seem to be here at different times. So there's not well, I mean, there are harbor porpoise here year round, but there does seem to be a little bit of a difference about when we're seeing the peaks in harbor porpoise and the bottlenose a little bit. So we will look into that in more detail as we're diving deeper into the data. But yeah, I mean, the harbor porpoise, we're detecting them year round, so they are here. But we will look more into, the foraging buzz presence versus foraging buzz presence of the bottlenose dolphins. So that's kind of part of what we'll look at as we dive deeper.
And I think this is, I mean, and maybe Jim, you tell us when we should pause, but I think this is a really interesting and timely one. So this might be the last question. And I know, like, we didn't really get to touch on this, but it's something of also considerable interest in that we're working on. Has noise levels in the harbor decreased during the current COVID-19 pandemic? A very topical discussion going on. So Mindy, do you want to weigh in with some thoughts there?
Yeah, thanks. We were hoping to finalize the analysis to present that, but unfortunately we had some issues with running the 2020 data. So that's something that we're going to be looking closely at, because obviously we have a really unique data set to be able to look at that and to monitor that. We did have recorders in the water over winter, and through we were meant to retrieve them actually during the initial shutdown. I think the week of the initial shutdown, which we couldn't retrieve them then because we couldn't guarantee safe practices on the water at that time. We didn't know what was going on. So the recorders stayed in the water through until we could get onto the boat with practicing safe COVID practices. But we did have, thankfully, recorders continue to record it, even though we thought that they would have stopped. So we did have a nice data set over that time period. So we will be diving more into that, so stay tuned. But we expect that noise would probably decrease during that time, and particularly recreational vessels would be significantly decreased. So it's going to be really interesting to see that, and look forward to talking more about that when we analyze it.
And Jim's given us the okay for a couple of more. So I'm trying to group a few because I see a couple of ones here that are, is there an, so I'm trying to like take some of those. Is there an increase in the number of marine mammals visiting that area? If so, what are the leading theories on why this is happening? And somebody else kind of asked, was it due to, water being cleaner? Was it, are populations increasing? Is food, more available? Mindy, do you want to weigh in on there? And I can jump in, and then we have a couple more that we can maybe, think about. So
yeah, I mean, we think it's probably a number of factors. There were fisheries regulations introduced for Atlantic menhaden around, what was it, 6 or 7 years ago now, that kind of did correlate quite nicely with this increase in particularly humpback whale sightings in New York. But I think it's we think it's really a combination of things. Probably the cleaner water helps the whole ecosystem. Sorry. Howard, you might need to take over on this one.
Yeah, no, and so I think it's, it's one of those things that I think that it's hard to tease out exactly the reasons, but I think they all play a role in essence. I think Tom Lake had some really interesting questions, and these might be things to circle back with. There are some great, it sounds like some anecdotal reports from the mid 20th century, and even I guess 20, 30 years ago, some great information where you're saying that there were pilot whales, coming up the river, and in harbor porpoise, up the river as well. And are there reasons to believe this? I mean, I think I think these can occur. We do know that these animals can move into these habitats. I mean, I think some of the this is where our sort of monitoring really kind of stopped at the sort of up into the upper bay, just within eyesight of the Statue of Liberty in essence. But I think we do see again, when this happened previously, there were always concerns of animals moving out of their normal habitat, and they might be stranding, they might have gotten moved in there, can't get out of it for whatever reasons, tidal. But historically, I think there's some good evidence that there were that these animals may have moved in and out of these habitats. I mean, Eric Sanderson and some of the work that he's done with Mannahatta and Wilikia have shown that there are some even newspaper accounts of these animals, not just maybe not these specific animals that you're asking about, but animals moving into in and around the New York City archipelago, if you will. And so swimming up the Hudson River are possibilities for one reason or another. I mean, Mindy, would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely.
I think we're doing okay, Jim, on answering some of those. Have we looked into detailed ocean acoustic propagation analysis? So I think this is really getting into soundscape modeling and looking at like ocean models and acoustic models. Times of low marine mammal detection could correlate to poor propagation conditions, and they'd be happy to talk about that offline. That'd be welcome, and thank you, Peter. But yeah, something that's very topical. We talked a little bit about that at the State of the Science in terms of soundscape modeling. But I think it's really important that the work that together WCS and HRF have done have really set the path for that in the New York Bay, in an area that wasn't covered in these areas. And I think, we've got two last questions that I think we should take. One from Simon from WCS, and one from Claudia Gelzer, who's former Coast Guard. So showed an awful lot of strandings around Long Island, were these primarily due to noise? I think that's really a question for Atlantic Marine Conservation Society, but there's probably not, some of those are historical and through time. I don't know that we have all the answer, but I don't know that any of them would probably be established or have been any established or triggered with noise. We have done some work where we've actually done quite a bit of work to link strandings with noise, and we can follow up with you, Simon, on that further. But I don't believe there's any evidence of that the strandings of harbor porpoise have been associated with noise. I gather not. And I think Claudia Gelzer's question relates to some of the other things in terms of the strategies related to mitigation for offshore wind farm construction. I think there's some great approaches that we're approaching collaboratively through the effort that's been spearheaded by NYSERDA. The NYSERDA folks also participated in that 2017 workshop that was at HRF. So I think they kind of go hand in hand, and they're aware of the work that we're doing here as well. And maybe this last question, Mindy, adding receivers into Sandy Hook Bay and Shrewsbury River, where there's a lot of recreational boating, you often see dolphins there. Do you want to speak to that, Mindy?
Yeah, that's great to know. That's we're really interested in trying to get these recorders, thinking about getting them back into the water. So hearing about where there may be dolphins sightings around is definitely of interest.
Well, thank you both again. That was really great, and thank you everyone who joined us. I think this is probably our last, because it is December. I guess it is our last for this year seminar. But if you have ideas for us and interest that you'd like to see us pursue in terms of future seminars, just let us know. And again, Howard, thank you so much. Mindy, excellent talk. And everyone stay safe.
Yeah, and thank you all. Thanks for the support from the Hudson River Foundation, and we look forward to hopefully continuing our work together.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, guys.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Stay well. Happy holidays, everybody.
Thank you.